Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. Happy Tuesday to you all, and here on this Tuesday afternoon we have another great show ahead for you, starting off by recapping that more than thrilling Monday Night Football game between the Bengals and Cowboys. What an exciting game that I was not expecting myself. Then our final fantasy regular season waiver wire update. These are the guys I truly can believe will help you in the postseason in fantasy. Continuing with my positional rankings, as always, my running backs and wide receivers for the final week of the regular season. And last but not least, concluding with my fantasy fact versus fiction. I feel like this segment will take on a different tone next week. We kind of recap the fantasy season, but ultimately I would love to conclude today's show with a bang, with one of my favorite segments I've introduced to this show. But without further ado, before we get into any of that fun stuff, let's remind you that if you want to continue getting content such as this, viewing content such as this, exclusive content from the show and the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing. Not just to my show either. There are a lot of great people in the GSMC world doing a lot of great things. So many different shows you can tune into. But if you do wish to interact and contribute a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions on air. Just leave a tip or donation. You can also do it through our website, gsmcpodcast.net, if you feel that way. But overall, it just makes this show that much more interactive, gets you, my faithful audience, involved as much as possible, ultimately just makes the show that much better. But without further ado, let us recap that very exhilarating Monday Night Football game from last night. And this game was a lot better than I expected it to be, and better than it should have even been. Bengals taking on the Cowboys on the road. Very exciting one. Ultimately, the 27-20 victors in this game. And it very much felt like a game in which it could have gone, much like how I saw it. Either the Cowboys defense locked in and kept it close and ultimately pulled this one out, or the Bengals offense ran roughshod over them. And we kind of got a mix of both in this one. There were moments of stellar offensive play from Cincinnati and moments where this Cowboys defense really proved that it's really found its footing these past couple of weeks. But ultimately, what I was talking about in the Cincinnati Bengals offense ultimately prevailed. Yes, it took a very bizarre blocked punt to do it, but it just goes to show that sometimes potent offenses like the Cincinnati Bengals can find ways to win in games such as these. But in terms of fantasy, it was a very exciting game. Definitely preparing you for your playoff push if you have some of these players here. But let's talk about potentially some other players as well in this segment who might not be on your fantasy roster that you might want to consider. So without further ado, let's recap this game. Joe Burrow, let's start off with him. He was perhaps the best performer in this one, continuing his MVP caliber play here. 33 for 44, 369 yards, 3 TDs, 1 interception for a total of 24.56 fantasy points, and he's just a paragon of consistency. If you're in the fantasy postseason and you believe that Joe Burrow is your guy, there should be no reason as to why you jump off this bandwagon right now. Yes, his team is out of it mathematically, supposedly. I still think that Joe Burrow is going to want to put as much into this season as possible, because this is a Bengals team that if all these contract situations get sorted out and, this defense under Lou Anarumo finds itself again, which I feel that they can do. It's just that a lot of defensive pieces from last year left, and they really didn't compensate for that very well in the offseason. I do believe that they can get things going, and it all starts with the excitement of Joe Burrow as your quarterback. When he's healthy, he's proven that he can be this MVP caliber player and is capable of leading you on a deep Super Bowl run. So next season, if they put all that together and the contracts figured out, then this team is going to be dangerous again. It's all going to come down to, though, that defense. And they really showed signs of what they can do in this one as well. So kudos to Joe Burrow maintaining his level of play in this one, even in what seemingly was a meaningless game. and then the Cincinnati Bengals defense finally stepping up in his stead. Let's talk about some other offensive stars, perhaps an unsung hero here for Cincinnati last night. How about Chase Brown? Doing it both in the run game and the pass game. 14 carries for 58 yards, 6 catches for 65 yards, and 1 touchdown for a total of 24.3 fantasy points. And I know he's not someone in fantasy football circles that looks appealing on paper, but what I saw last night from him proved that he can be a very important piece of this Bengals offense in the future. A lot of people might not even think that in terms of fantasy playoffs, you should be looking towards the future as well, but it comes as par for the course here, right? Yes, you want to win your postseason games. Yes, you want to be your fantasy champion, but you also want to look ahead to the long-term future in terms of maintaining your fantasy consistency as well. And Chase Brown looks like one of those players who can carry over into next year and be a positive aspect of this Bengals offense. This Zach Moss acquisition was a failure, right? And I feel like Chase Brown, when he's on the field, just looks a lot more explosive, a lot more impactful in the Cincinnati Bengals offense than Moss ever was. And so that's why I feel like this game was a proving ground for what Chase Brown could be next year. And so I'm really happy to see a guy like Chase Brown do this during this time in the fantasy season, when a lot of people may be making last-minute decisions for the fantasy postseason, but also might be thinking ahead to next year, because now he's going to be someone who might be a hotter commodity next year than right now. And so that's why I feel like this performance was very telling for him. And last but not least, let's talk about Ja'Marr Chase. Might just be the best fantasy wide receiver to take into the fantasy postseason should you have him. 177 yards and 14 catches, 2 touchdowns for a grand total of 45.1 fantasy points. He is the guarantee at the wide receiver 1 position for me. Out of all these receivers, yes, you have your Justin Jeffersons. Yes, you have your CeeDee Lambs we played again last night, and also we're going to talk about in this one. But ultimately, Ja'Marr Chase is someone who has developed such a rapport with Joe Burrow from his college career to now that he just is a stalwart player at the position in fantasy that you can't ignore no matter what. And even in this down year, even with all this rumors of contract situations and extensions and things of that nature, he still is a premier wide receiver in this league. And yes, depending on how this contract situation shakes out, if it gets finalized immediately during the offseason or it's put on the back burner for a while, he still is someone you're going to highly covet year in, year out for as long as the Bengals have this duo together, because it is the best in the National Football League, and they continue to prove it week in, week out, no matter the result. And that's why Ja'Marr Chase, like I said, is the guarantee of the wide receiver 1 position out of all these different receivers. And ultimately, this was a good team win for the Bengals. Really showed how multifaceted they can be at their best. They finally got a fully complementary game from their defense, and Joe Burrow was able to get it done in crunch time like he knows how to. And that's the difference between these two teams. But on the Cowboys side of things, I don't think they should really feel as dismayed as they seemed last night. Obviously, we saw a very exasperated Micah Parsons on the sideline after that blocked punt and the resulting touchdown. So you can see that there is a lot of frustration when things go wrong for the Cowboys. But I feel like in some of these losses in this quote-unquote Cooper Rush era, they can keep their heads held high because they're not playing terribly. It's just that more often than not, these teams have some sort of aspect to them. For Cincinnati, it's their offense. For other teams, it could be their defense that really keys in on exploiting these Cowboys' weaknesses. And not for nothing, this isn't necessarily a weak football team right now. They know their strengths. It just came down to lack of execution in key moments. It came down to the Bengals really taking advantage of certain situations. But ultimately, This team played very well last night. I was very impressed by 3 individuals specifically. First, I started off with CeeDee Lamb because he deserves all the plaudits for technically keeping this offense afloat despite all its limitations right now. He is an exemplary receiver at the end of the day, no matter what I think of this offense when it's just keyed in on him receiving the football. But I still think I can't judge him just on that alone because he truly is an exemplary receiver in this league. 6 receptions, 93 yards, 1 touchdown, 21.4 fantasy points for him. He's going to continue to do this as the season plays out. But one guy who I'm really happy to see continue this good stretch of form is Rico Dowdle. 18 carries, 131 yards, 15.1 fantasy points. And if they continue to rely on him in this offense from here on out, then I see there being a lot more bright spots to this Dallas offense next year than there was this year. So that's why I'm really excited about Rico Dowdle. And last but not least, let's talk about this competent, serviceable job that Cooper Rush is doing. He's not going to be a factor, let's be real here, in the fantasy postseason. But he is proving that he's like one of the most competent backup quarterbacks in the NFL when things go wrong for Dallas. 16 of 31, 183 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 13.82 fantasy points. Again, not big from a fantasy perspective, but still performance that merits consideration next year. If you're looking for, in a deeper league, a flex option, or say Cooper Rush after this signed somewhere else, where it's a more advantageous situation for him to get significant playing time, then he could potentially be a nice little QB2 or flex option in a deeper league, mind you. But overall, this Cowboys offense should keep their heads held high. They did a lot of great things last night, but there was just in key moments where they kind of let it slip, and ultimately the Bengals took advantage of that. But overall, very exhilarating game from last night. I did not expect as good a game as we got last night. But let me know what you think about it in the comments, because coming up next, we transition to our final waiver wire update of the fantasy regular season. These are going to be the guys who I believe can be hidden gems for you should you pick them up before the fantasy playoffs. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.